Hi and welcome. I'm Marcha Chaudry, an attorney and the founder of the Equity and Wellness Collaborative, and I'm so glad you're here for this first episode of our new series, EWC Uncovered. This series is designed to unpack the conversations that matter most in the beauty industry, especially where marketing, regulation, and public trust intersect. We're starting with clean beauty because it remains an influential yet undefined claim in the industry. As someone who's helped guide large national brands, as well as over 40 startups and independent beauty founders through compliance reviews, labels, strategy, claim substantiation, I can say there's no legally defined standard for clean beauty, yet it's everywhere. So that's why we're here. And today's discussion is about clarity, accountability, and strategy. So we're going to discuss what clean beauty really means, who's defining it, what brands must consider as they market themselves in 2025 and beyond. I'm joined by three amazing experts who bring deep insight from legal, brand, and ingredient side of this space. So I'll start by introducing our guests. First, we have Raphael. Rachel is a partner at Morgan Lewis who represents companies in all tiers of the supply, distribution chain, and in various industries, including consumer product, personal care, and cosmetic. Rachel defends clients in complex product liability and class action litigation. She also advises clients on various issues that arise over the product life cycle, whether it's handling customer complaints, executing product recalls, or negotiating with supply chain partners. As a litigator and risk management counselor, Rachel also helps companies navigate the many legal risks associated with manufacturing, distribution, labeling, and marketing their products. We also have Maggie Spicer, the founder of Source Beauty ESG. Maggie is an attorney and the founder, as I mentioned, and she is based in DC and has a firm specializing in sustainability and social impact in the beauty and personal care sector. Maggie works with global brands and retailers on issues related to product design, marketing, compliance, corporate strategy. She previously was an associate with a global law firm, White & Case, where she specialized in trade, compliance, and business and human rights before moving in-house at Amazon to serve as supply chain and regulatory counsel. And last but not least, we have Gay Timmons, founder and president of OO Organic. Gay Timmons owns and operates OO Organic, as I mentioned, and specialty ingredient distribution. And the company is committed to the development and delivery of sustainable agricultural ingredients for the cosmetic and personal care product industry. Since 1991, she has worked as a producer and marketer of organic ingredients and advocate for regulatory clarity for organic and natural producers and consumers. Gay graduated from UC Davis and has an MS in physiology. That was a lot. Very brilliant attendees and panelists here. So I want to start with the first question, which is who defines clean? And I'll start with Rachel. You and I both co-authored an article tackling clean beauty in 2025 and beyond, and it was published in Happy Magazine. In it, we point out that there is still no formal legal definition of clean beauty in the US, and the FDA hasn't defined it, the FTC hasn't either, and not even in its green guides. And even in the EU, where regulations are more robust, there's still no official regulatory definition of clean. So I want to talk about who do you think is actually shaping the definition of clean beauty right now? I'll also go to the other panelists, but I want to start with Rachel. And also, as you unpack that question, I would like to, go into the discussion of, is it retailers creating their own standards? Are brands, is it brands that are trying to differentiate it? Or is it like consumers whose expectations are driving the demand? Who is really shaping the definition of clean beauty?
So I think the answer in short is kind of all of the above. Marcia, as you mentioned, the biggest issue here is that we don't have kind of one universal definition. And so you see companies that are using the term in a way that best suits their needs. And you might have consumers that are on the same page, and you also might have consumers that see that and interpret it entirely differently. In my experience, consumers and brands are really the two factions that are driving the charge. For consumers, particularly this, kind of more recent generation of consumers, you have things like wellness and authenticity and sustainability that are really a priority for them. And this increase in consumer demand means opportunities. Opportunities means revenue for brands. And setting yourself apart by getting a competitive advantage or edge in the space is a really critical component of that. You do have these programs through retailers, which I think can add confusion, but also be helpful for purposes of comparing one brand to another. It helps us get a little bit of kind of homogeneity, but among the way a lot of different brands may be using that term. But so in short, I guess in my experience, it's really been, everyone is part of shaping that, but we're not quite at some universal definition, which is why, we have this disconnect that is the subject of our article, as well as many other publications, and a lot of the reason why it's so interesting to talk about today.
Yeah, that's very true. We are seeing some disconnect, and you know, Maggie and Gay, do you have any insight on, is it between, where is this disconnect coming? Is it between, consumers, like I mentioned, retailers, they all have their own standards, and we can get into that later.
I mean, I think there's exactly what Rachel said, like there's an opportunity, and retailers will always take an opportunity to have some sort of market differentiation. I think the problem is everyone has very different expectations of what a term like clean can mean. And so retailers typically do their best to develop a standard and communicate it clearly, but like we saw with the Sephora class action lawsuit last year, even when there is still a level of clarity around a standard for clean beauty, when a consumer doesn't understand that standard, or they're coming in with their own perception of things like whether synthetics can count as clean, or whether the presence of synthetics could allow a product to be considered clean. When you have that kind of a disconnect, you're always going to run into those types of problems. And so I think we're kind of at a critical inflection point where retailers are doing their best, brands are doing their best. I don't think most companies are going into this with malicious intent, but there is just going to be a level of kind of confusion when there's no regulatory definition. And we know that the FTC is not going to be defining this anytime soon. And so I think it's kind of on all of us as different players in the industry to come together and have these conversations around, if we don't have a standardized definition, what can we at least agree on as a baseline for what we can talk about when we talk about clean beauty?
Yeah, very good point. Gay?
First of all, I have to express that I always feel really a great deal of sympathy and empathy for consumers who are trying to figure this out for themselves, because they're ultimately the people dealing with us. And it's so hard. And if I go to a party, people always say, well, what shampoo should I use? And I go, I don't know. It's terrible. Because it's really hard, because it is chemistry. And so I think that I completely concur with what they've said. The retailers are, I think they are trying to take advantage of whatever differentiation and opportunities they see, but I also think that those differentiations are starting to blend, because one company will do one thing and then another company will do another thing. I work with a lot of brands, and the hardest thing for me to get a brand to do is to define what they mean by clean when they say they want clean. Because I basically say you have to justify your claim. This is your responsibility as a brand owner. So I think that's that makes it really difficult. And I think the other thing is you're smack up against hardcore chemistry that gets divided into two different parts. One is, what are the ingredients called, which is always a mystery, quite honestly, and not really well managed, just in my estimation, in the United States. And the other part of it is that the people who actually make ingredients, there's very little transparency. The consumers are never going to know how people make these ingredients. And so when you're trying to figure out what clean means, whether you're a brand or a retailer, unless you can dig all the way through, you're in trouble, potentially. Because we all keep learning stuff. I keep waiting for the day when somebody's husband is a chemical engineer and he picks up her stuff and says, "Oh my God." So yeah, that's kind of how I see it is, and I also think that this is a real evolution, because we're all pushing everybody forward a little bit more as we try to answer these questions.
If I could add something to what Gay was just saying, I think there's also been a lot of confusion, especially on the brand side, but definitely on the consumer side, around whether clean means something is sustainable, whether natural means it's more environmentally friendly. And we know that's not always the case, but there is so much, there's so much opacity behind the scenes. How are ingredients made? How are they sourced? Having a voice like Gay's in the conversation is so important, because you want somebody who is literally seeing the value chain of those ingredients, but most brands are not able to work with somebody with that level of visibility. They're kind of just buying ingredients off the shelf, or they're working with the manufacturers saying, oh yeah, these are sustainable ingredients. But for some ingredients, a synthetic is going to be much more environmentally friendly than the naturally derived version. And so getting kind of in the weeds is really intimidating to a lot of brands. But when they want to be making those claims around things like clean or green or natural claims, it's a really important part of the process to be willing to kind of dig in and understand like what goes into those products. Even if you have a restricted substances list, how are those products actually being sourced and manufactured? It's kind of the next level, and where I think we're starting to go as an industry.
Yeah,
Well,
definitely.
and oh, sorry. I was going to say that raises a really interesting point, Maggie, because I think there's also, we've talked about maybe the disconnect between what brands are doing and what consumers' expectations are, but I think there's also confusion among consumers themselves as to what they want out of their products. So, and the like the point you really just raised, Maggie, is, consumer sees natural and says, oh, I want natural because natural means this. And to your point, synthetic maybe actually, if what you want is sustainable, that may not actually be getting at the ends that you think it is. And so there's also, I think, a confusion just among the consumer population itself as to what is achieving, what their goals are when they are looking at products, and what actually achieves those products as a matter of a reality.
Yeah, and over the last few years, we've seen a surge of consumer-driven lawsuits targeting clean brands, not just for what's on the label, but what's implied across websites and social and brand messaging. I know, Maggie, you mentioned the Sephora lawsuit. There's been, specific brands that have had class action lawsuits with different marketing terms, from natural to clean. And so this is a question back to you, Rachel. What do you think is driving this uptick in litigation and regulatory scrutiny? Yeah.
Sure. So, as I mentioned earlier, you have these consumers who are increasingly prioritizing certain things, the wellness and sustainability in particular of the products that they use. And, consumer products, personal care, cosmetics is no exception. And so just as, brands are realizing that there's this opportunity and trying to find ways to capitalize on it, and by setting themselves apart primarily by promoting their products for the wellness or sustainability attributes, it's also going to garner attention from some of your other, I would call them industry actors. State regulators, industry groups, advocacy groups, the plaintiffs bar, are, also seeing the same ambiguity that we're all discussing today, and realizing that confusion, consumer confusion, is frankly a fertile ground for litigation. In some cases, it's really trying to hold companies' feet to the fire and make sure that they're able to back up their claims. In other cases, it's opportunistic, as litigation can be. And I think you're seeing also an increased activity among these groups, because there's a general sense that while we don't all have a crystal ball, I think the expectation is we won't be seeing a ton of regulation from the federal regulatory action. That this is not the biggest priority among others, particularly over the next, over the near term, the next 4 years. And so I think you have these other groups who are looking to step up and fill some kind of enforcement void and find other ways to try and kind of continue the momentum that's been growing around, clean and green beauty. And so I think, just as with anything, when you see the popularity of these products and claims associated with these specific attributes, you're then on the flip side, a little bit delayed, albeit, get that scrutiny, whether it's from regulatory actors or the plaintiffs bar to, particularly I think in this industry, we are often seeing kind of innovation outpace regulation. And so it's a way for these other actors in the industry to kind of fill that gap.
Yeah, and then from Maggie and Gay, from your perspective, I guess, where do you see this risk most acute for brands? Is it, like right now, is it the claim itself? Is it the supply chain, internal documentation, or is it something else entirely?
I would say, I think there's a couple of different issues in terms of risk. The claims are always going to lead back to the knowledge of the ingredients and of the product. And I think one of the big problems I've encountered, and I just ran into this with a consulting job I was doing, the chemist didn't really know how the ingredients were made, was making a natural and, in this case, safe claim, which always scares me. And the brand owner didn't know how to question it. She just absolutely had no idea how to question it. And when I started asking questions, it became very apparent to her. She was very bright. She got it immediately, but there was a real barrier about the knowledge of where everything was coming from between the contract manufacturer and the brand owner. And I see that frequently because they go, "Oh, I'm a chemist. I don't want to explain." I don't. And chemistry is hard. I don't blame them. You can't teach somebody chemistry in a half-an-hour meeting. And then I think the other thing is that we don't give ourselves enough room within the whole clean thing. I keep saying that this is an evolution. The concept of clean, the concept of, how we end up defining these words is going to continuously change over time until there's some real, until we do have some regulatory clarity. But it's going to take us a while to figure it out, because safety and sustainability and clean are 3 completely different concepts in my mind. And I don't know that I can define clean still. Sustainability, I can define. Safe, as a physiologist, I have a definition based on physical science, physiological science. So I think those are all problems that are posed to brand owners, especially as they make different kinds of claims and how they check those boxes about what they mean by those claims.
Where I think the brands are kind of getting themselves into trouble is where you see the entire effort for claims being led exclusively by the marketing team. and there's no check, there's no balance, there's no kind of cross-functional dialogue happening. Even for small brands, there are other voices that need to be involved in that conversation when you're developing claims. A marketer's job is not to understand the science or really think about the supply chain. A marketer's job is to sell the products, is to create the claims that ideally they can validate, but marketers sometimes can play a little fast and loose, and they're not attorneys or regulatory compliance specialists. So they frequently are doing their jobs, but they're not necessarily taking into account the level of substantiation that might make Rachel and myself breathe a little easier as we're reviewing things. So a lot of times it's really marketers get kind of stuck in a room and they're given a mandate to go sell a product. They know that their customer is looking for clean beauty because that's what, the market research has told them. And so they're using the language that the industry has kind of told them works. And when you don't have that level of visibility into what are the best practices, what are the regulations, and even kind of not informal, but independently enforceable standards like the green guides, like what are those best practices saying that you should and shouldn't make around claims on things like ingredient safety and sustainability and clean, which I never, I don't think I've ever asked a brand to say clean once. Usually when we dig into it, we find better ways of describing what's in the product, and it ends up giving more life and color to the brand and to the product anyway, because clean has become so ubiquitous at this point that everyone's got a different standard. So it kind of means nothing and everything at the exact same time. So really not putting the full burden of that responsibility onto the marketing team, and instead bringing in all the different experts within your company or within the kind of external resources that you use to make sure that you're really thinking strategically about how you make those claims and how you validate them. If more brands did that, I think we wouldn't be seeing this backlash around clean.
That is true. I really love that point. I work with several brands and I work with their marketing team, and they don't like me so much because I'm pushing back on the claims like you cannot say this. There needs to be, sometimes you do need that extra layer of checking and making sure that the risk are low for the claims being made. So that's a great point. I want to shift to the international landscape because while clean beauty still lacks a formal legal definition, regulators outside of the US are starting to crack down on how environmental and sustainability claims are made. The EU, for example, has proposed the Green Claims Directive, and that marks a significant regulatory shift. So I'd love to hear from everyone. And Maggie, I can just kick this off to you to start. If you can briefly explain, well, first, what the FTC Green Guides are for those in the audience who may not be familiar, starting with the US, and then also how do you see those guidelines evolving in comparison to what the EU is proposing?
Okay, I feel like we could spend the whole hour just on that one. Okay, so the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, they put out ideally every 10 years, an update to this document called the Green Guides. And it's really a guideline for marketers to use when they're making claims around environmental performance or benefits or attributes of products and services. So it's important to know that this is a living document. It's not something that is independently enforceable, but it can be used in FTC enforcement cases around things like deceptive or misleading claims. So it does sort of represent best practices around making environmental marketing claims. And they're currently updating it. So every 10 years, they go through this review process. They put out a notice for open comment. Companies, consumers, retail, everyone is allowed to provide comments on what are the specific claims that you want to see more guidance on. What is your perception of the claims guidance that we have now? So there's this open comment period. We're supposed to be getting an update. I don't think anyone's holding their breath at this point. They tend to take their time when they update the green guides. But what we saw was a real focus on recyclability. So the FTC had a workshop called Talking Trash during this first review period, and they were focusing specifically on recyclability claims, which I think is incredibly important and reflective of where the US market is right now, because even though we do not have, like Rachel was saying, federal action on things like recyclability and sustainability, the states are not slowing down. And in fact, I think they're taking a lot of cues of, well, the Trump administration does not align quite aggressively with sustainability. So it's on the states to really put forward a lot of these actions. So that means we're seeing things not just in California, but in other states as well around recyclability claims. So California has this new truth in labeling law, but also things like extended producer responsibility, which are looking at the actual life cycle of packaging and making the producer, mostly the brands for beauty, responsible for how much of the packaging waste that they're creating in each state. So there's a lot happening in the US at the state level. Ideally, the FTC captures what's going on in the green guides, and so they're able to kind of keep up with the momentum. That tends to not happen. So right now we're still using the old version from 2012, but we should be getting an update soon. And I think if we were to take kind of the conversation that's happening around that review period and look at it globally, it's very reflective of what's happening in other, like the EU and the UK. They are also aggressively pushing reform and updates to guidelines for environmental marketing claims, and then really digging in on the sustainability of packaging and carbon footprinting. So even if you're a company that isn't selling as much in the US, but you're focusing in the EU is light years ahead of where the US is. It's the same in Australia, same in Canada. There are a lot of countries that are really pushing forward. And so even without an update to the green guides, there is almost no excuse at this point to not understand how to make these claims appropriately for your brand, because it's just becoming such a critical piece of operating in today's economy. And I think Rachel would probably agree, a lot of times it can be relatively straightforward. Where brands get themselves into trouble is they want to make 100% claims, gay, 100% natural, 100% safe. There is no need to do that because it's very difficult to prove 100% of something or broad-based environmental benefit claims if it's eco-friendly. Green Guide says eco-friendly could mean it's environmentally friendly on packaging, on ingredients. It means everything. And there's almost no way to substantiate that. So when you kind of get the basics down and you think about what's relevant for your brand, I think there can be some relatively straightforward ways to kind of incorporate all these new best practices.
Thank you for that. Yeah. So it sounds like legal and regulatory should be a part of all startup brands, or many startup brands, and most startup brands, at least for a compliance check, especially with marketing claims. Do you have any insights on the language of sustainability? We see that also across different marketing terms like eco, natural, plant-based, biodegradable, green. Those words are everywhere, from product labels to digital campaigns. And then you mentioned the FTC Green Guides is 10 years, delay, or it's 10 years that they come out with a new guide. And the last one was in 2012. And then, the EU is advancing on different directives. So I'd love for you to just, talk about how, when you work with brands, how are you advising on trying to use language that signals sustainability or environmental responsibility?
Yeah, I'm happy to talk about this, and then I'd love to hear Rachel's thoughts on it as well. I mean, I typically work with brands. The first exercise is just understanding who they are as a brand, because I think brands want to make all the sustainability claims in the world. And if you don't understand who your audience is and what they're interested in, there's really no logical way to do it. So we kind of start with understanding what makes sense for you as a brand, what kind of claims make sense and will resonate with your audience. For a younger audience, they really care about packaging sustainability. They want to hear about responsible sourcing. A more mature audience or a luxury brand, it's a totally different conversation. And so a lot of times you can really tailor it. And then it's just kind of working backwards from what are the moments of communication? Is it on your package? Is it on your claim? Is it on your website? I was talking about this earlier, but like Gay's Company O Organics has this incredible newsletter. So even things like email marketing are great opportunities to tell more complex stories versus, you have this much room on a product package. That's not where your sustainability claims need to live. Like there's very little way to provide nuance on a label. So understanding kind of what your ecosystem looks like and then tailoring the types of claims you should be making to that ecosystem helps marketers a lot of times kind of focus on what the claims are that they should be making. And then they can go work with the internal teams on understanding how do they validate those claims. Because if you looked at between the US, the EU, and the UK, there is substantial guidance on how to make environmental claims. So I actually prefer working in the sustainability marketing space because there's quite a lot of robust guidance out there. Even things like everybody wants to make compostability claims for packaging, which I think is great. Everyone's concerned about where their product goes after it breaks down. But there's a nuance between industrially compostable and home compostable, and brands are not getting that right. And all the guidance in those jurisdictions is all very consistent. Like you have to have that clarification. So a customer isn't putting something that has to go to an industrial facility in their home compost. Like that shouldn't happen. So a lot of it is just figuring out what makes sense for your brand, who are you speaking to, and how should you be speaking to them? And then it gives the marketers all they need to actually get the process started.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
oh, sorry.
no, go ahead. I was going to kick it to both you and Gay.
Yeah, I echo all of what Maggie said. I think understanding, at the end of the day, what the brand identity is and who you are targeting with the products is really critical to kind of figuring out what claims make sense. There's this tendency to either go really aggressive or frankly just throw spaghetti at the wall and see what sticks. And I think that we're seeing a much more discerning population of consumers, who really, there may be confusion among what gets them there, but they have a clear, I think, sense of what they want. And I think nuance, living in the nuance, actually brands overlook that as a way to set yourself apart, right? And the storytelling component to it brings authenticity to the claim. I think that consumers see the all or nothing approach, right? 100% this or that with some skepticism. And so being able to, not just have the backup in some file somewhere, but to be able to tell the story and communicate to the consumer that you're not just saying these things, but you're choosing your words carefully to reflect what's true and accurate about the product, goes a long way, both in terms of generating the loyalty and providing, this air of transparency, which I think is increasingly important to consumers as well. And so we certainly caution against kind of the 100% this or always that or all this, because that's hard to back up and put your money where your mouth is, but it's also not always the most appealing. And to the extent that every other competitor is doing that, there might be a way, frankly, to be a bit more conservative, but provide more of a narrative or a context and actually set yourself apart in a different way than one would think, when they're looking at these things. And, there's this natural instinct to say, well, of course you want 100% always everything. I mean, again, their consumers these days are really looking for authentic and transparent actors and companies. And so I think that there's a way of saying, well, not quite, right? And let's be honest about that. This is what we really do. And I think that people believe that more.
Thank you, Rachel.
So I completely appreciate what both of you are saying. It's really hard to be all things to all people, and it's probably just not a good idea. I certainly, I remember starting, my business is 25 years old, and I remember starting my business trying to figure out, where do I fit? How do I hone in? Because even though I'm a B2B and I sell primarily ingredients, I still have to brand myself. I have to promote myself. I have to make claims, and I got to back them up. And to address some of the stuff that Maggie was talking about, I think one of the most valuable things a brand can do is identify the resources that are out there. When we talk about sustainability and sustainability claims, like when you talk about recycling, there are multiple legal definitions of compostable. When I get information on it, because of the world I'm in, it literally, they will cite which law in EPA or USDA, and they're in multiple places too. So you know, you need to be aware of what your resources are. And then with ingredients, there are so many certifications. And that I think is hugely challenging, but I do not believe that it serves a cosmetic brand particularly well to be certified to a single standard. Sometimes it does. If you're willing to make that commitment, it's expensive, it's hard, it takes a great deal of work. And I love it when people can do that. And I trust it because I know somebody's in there once a year looking at them. However, I don't think it's the best overall approach. But understanding which each of those standards use and what they bring to the table for you as a resource. You know, so if you're using something for that's organic under the USDA law, and you're using something that's organic under one of the European cosmetic standards, which are not laws, they're private standards, you can really talk to them and say, you know, this has been validated, and you give those tools then to the nice ladies who are going to defend you if necessary. But I really think identifying those sources or resources is just core to understanding the world you live in. And then on top of that, you've got all your regulatory stuff. And certainly there's a lot of resources to understand regulatory requirements as well. There's still a great many of, you know, just sort of these explainers in FDA, and they're really very helpful. And they're not the law. This is how this law works, sort of explainers. There's one on labeling. There's you know, there's a lot on the difference between soap and is it a cosmetic? There's a lot on you know, the OTC categories. Is it a drug or is it a cosmetic? So again, resources. This world is infinite. The amount of information you can get is just remarkable. So take the time and look it up. You know, I always laugh. I'm the oldest person in this industry, as far as I can tell. There's a few people who are older than I am. Mindy Goldstein, I think. And I am constantly saying when people ask me questions, oh, you can Google that. You can find that out. You don't have to ask me. So yeah, look it up.
And Gay, you work directly with suppliers, certifiers, and raw material producers. So you see how sourcing actually works behind the marketing.
Yeah.
From your vantage point, what do you think is most often misunderstood or oversimplified when brands talk about, you know, these claims that we've mentioned?
I think they don't understand how ingredients are made. Nothing is 100%. If you pick a bean and or a seed and you crush it, you've still changed its form. And it's come in contact with other things. And then you have to test it to see if it picked anything up from that contact. You know, does it have, I use this all the time. Shea butter is very popular, comes out of West Africa. A lot of the shea butter is collected by women's collectives. They, because it's wildcrafted, it is not a crop. So they have their territories, they collect the shea nuts, they shell them, they pound the flesh into a paste, basically. And usually it is shipped to Europe for refining. The reason it is much better to use that shipped to Europe for refined product is that the equipment that they're using in those small rustic processing areas in West Africa is that the shea butter itself picks up metal molecules. Like if you used a stone, or if you used, you know, there's a heavy iron bar that you use to crush the nuts. Iron or any metal initiates a rancidity in oil. So you want to get those metal molecules out. And the only way to do it is to refine it. And you can tell the difference when you smell an unrefined shea and a refined shea that are both 6 or 9 months old. One will be starting to go. So it's something as simple as that can have an impact. And then you get into the other end of it, biosynthesis or really complex synthetic chemistry, which we need. We really need to be able to, hydrogenate things. And there's all kinds of green chemistry that contributes fantastic qualities to ingredients that we need. But you need chemical engineers for that. And you need to let them be experts and begin to try to understand what sorts of questions you have to ask. So, I think it's just be completely unafraid to ask questions. I always tell people to ask for two things. One is a composition statement that says, what is everything that is in this ingredient? Not a spec sheet, not an SDS, none of that, a composition statement. What's in here? The other thing I always tell them to ask for is a production flow chart, which shows how it's made. And those two things should align. You should be able to see on the composition statement where all the ingredients that are in the final product or ingredient entered the production of that material. So again, just be unafraid. It's not brain surgery. It is chemistry, and it's a little daunting at times, but sometimes it's just a diagram and it's just a matter of paying attention.
I love that, because I was going to ask you, what do you wish brands ask more often when validating ingredient or material claims? So is it those two questions? Love it. So Maggie, I'd love for you to follow up with how that influences strategy and messaging.
Yeah. I mean, I think it definitely circles back to the brand identity piece, because what Gay is talking about is really understanding the breadth of what ingredients can represent, not just what they can be composed of and the process that they can undergo, but what they represent as part of your formula and what they represent as part of your brand. There are brands who will come to me and say, we want to be as sustainable as possible, and we want to use X, Y, and Z ingredients because that's the scent profile that we've determined that our consumer loves. And I will kind of walk them through, okay, here are some of the options, and then we'll get to biotech-based synthetics, and they'll say, oh, absolutely not. I'm not using a biotech sandalwood, for example. And then we'll go into it and we'll, kind of talk about, why are you so committed to what you've defined as natural versus synthetic? And they'll say, oh, well, I don't think our consumer is going to understand that a synthetic isn't bad. I'm like, well, I don't think consumers are unwilling to listen and learn. I think they want to have these conversations. But what I think they're less amenable to finding out is that you're sourcing natural sandalwood, for example, that's at a high rate of extinction in a lot of places where it's being sourced from, or that you're sourcing materials where you have a high risk of labor violations. And so I think having a more nuanced conversation as part of your initial strategy and as part of the strategy that you kind of return back to over and over again is really important, because it can help you align how you think about ingredient sourcing and product development and then marketing. It really goes back to, who are the people you're trying to speak to? What are you trying to communicate to them and build for them? And if it's something that is sustainable and you're willing to have a nuanced conversation, then you can kind of take them behind the scenes and say, this is the product we're building, and we found a company that's using renewable energy. It's located in the US. They're lower shipping distance. There's a lot that goes into sustainability that has absolutely nothing to do with whether the packaging is recyclable or whether you are using a natural ingredient. And so I feel like what brands don't realize is the basket of things that they can talk about and options they can explore is huge. And brands right now are only cherry picking a few different things. And I think the more they learn about companies like O Organics, I feel like this is a paid ad for O Organics. It is definitely not. I just have followed Gay's work for a long time. And I do feel like what she represents is access to nuanced information, which is, from a claims perspective and from a strategy perspective, is great, because it means I have more to work with if the brand is willing to have a more comprehensive conversation and they're willing to think more creatively and innovatively about, well, what could we build that isn't the exact same. I had a brand that said, we're interested in a clean brand for sensitive skin. Like, you and everyone else. Like there are 100 of those brands out there.
Mhm.
That's not to say you shouldn't launch it. It's just to say you're in a very crowded market and a really tough economic situation. So how can we go back to the drawing board, look at all the myriad ways that you can really explore sustainability and social impact and responsible brand building that is different and might give you that market edge that otherwise if you just stuck yourself in the clean beauty category, you're never gonna compete. And it's gonna be very difficult to make a claim that Rachel and I aren't going to be banging our heads on our desks trying to help you validate. Thinking strategically can help get you out of that place and get you somewhere where you might be able to succeed a little bit more.
Thank you. I feel like the dots are connecting. So Rachel, maybe you can speak to the kind of documentation or internal review a brand should have in place when making these kinds of sourcing claims.
Sure. And so, kind of to harken back to what Gay had said earlier, what we are seeing oftentimes in litigation is that, with all the company has on their plate, it's pretty natural for a brand to kind of rely sometimes entirely on the word of, a third party contract manufacturer or supplier, just kind of as a way to check the box without any real effort to kick the tires and ask for the right kind of backup and support, and without being intimidated by the chemistry, as Gay mentioned, but not really engaging in an understanding of what, frankly, from a litigation perspective, they're going to be responsible for knowing. Right? You can't really put your head in the sand in this case and say, well, if there's an issue, it's not on me. That couldn't be farther. And so it's in companies' best interest to do this, not just to make sure that the folks in that the claims they're saying are accurate, but even if you're completely self-interested from a litigation standpoint, it makes sense to do that also, and to do your homework, so to speak. And I think part and parcel to that too is setting up clear expectations with any third party that's kind of in the manufacturing and processing chain, having robust audit rights in those contracts with third parties, and actually exercising those audit rights are important to see, and being able to have that documentation that's kind of related to the what's helpful backup. I think ultimately, in terms of what documentation does a company need, and we've been talking kind of at a higher level, it will, specifically what you need in a litigation context is going to depend on exactly what claim you're making, and how the company is internally deciding to define that claim. So for example, if a company has marketed its products as clean, and by clean, it means it doesn't have these 20 ingredients, then you better have documentation where you can back up the fact that you don't have those ingredients, right? So, that, and I think the more that you can point to independent testing and verification, seems to be helpful. Those are the types of things I think that's important. If you do end up in the unfortunate circumstance where you're trying to defend yourself in litigation, that documentation is not necessarily going to help you avoid a lawsuit altogether. And I think that is a risk that companies need to be aware of when they make any of these types of claims. But I think doing your homework ahead of time and making sure you're having a true understanding of your products and where they're coming from and how they're being manufactured, means that you're going to more likely make better educated claims about your products and could be less likely to put a target on your back. Sometimes it's inevitable, and I know that there's a lot of scrutiny, and not all lawsuits, of course, have merit. So, but the more you're able to get a better understanding about your product, and the more you're carefully both documenting that and then being thoughtful about the claims you're making, I think it may be helpful in terms of avoiding a target on your back from a litigation standpoint.
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes left, and you all have provided such good nuggets for brands. We have a lot of registrants in this webinar today, and even more that registered. So I just want to go around and just get one or two takeaways from each of you that could help a brand build trust while staying compliant. legally, operationally, or strategically?
Do you want me to start or?
Sure.
Okay. So I guess if I had one takeaway, it would be just context is king. It's a smart business move in a couple of ways. I think as we've discussed, it gives the impression that the company is trying to be upfront and transparent by helping what it means to helping the consumer understand what the company means when it makes certain claims about its products. It may also, because I have my litigator hat on, be the best defense against a claim if a product, in terms of a product being potentially, false and misleading as advertised. So false advertising claims are based on this reasonable consumer person standard. What would deceive or mislead a reasonable person? And so the more context that a company provides, for example, when I say X, I mean it's only free of these specific ingredients. It's going to be harder in a litigation context to argue that the reasonable consumer would interpret that product to be free of anything that could be remotely harmful to me or the environment, regardless of how remote, right? So that's why I think context or nuanced, however narrative storytelling, all of that is really critical, not just as a useful marketing tool and from a business perspective, but also from a litigation and risk exposure perspective.
And I'll say for me, the biggest takeaway is always just don't leave the marketers in a room alone and expect them to get it right. It's just not fair to them. It's not fair to you. It's not fair to the consumers. It's really critical that everybody be brought into the conversation, and that's everyone from product development to procurement to sales. It's kind of a feeling of everyone's in this. And so we can find opportunities to collaborate, to understand how to validate claims, how to make the claims. And when people feel brought into the process, they take more ownership over it. I think it can feel a little awkward at first because making marketing claims is marketing's territory. But if they don't understand kind of what the guardrails are in terms of the standards and best practices, then it's very difficult to expect them to get it right on their own. And so once you put those guardrails in place and create the understanding of how you need to validate these claims, then it's about creating a process where the right internal stakeholders are brought together to actually make sure that those claims are being validated. And then you have an ongoing process. As you develop new claims, you iterate over and over again. How do we make sure we're getting the right data to validate the claims? We tell product development, hey, these are things that we're thinking about. These are claims we want to make. So as you source new ingredients or develop new products, let's keep that in mind and make it a more integrated process. And that can make things run much more seamlessly, but can also do Rachel a favor in the long term by really kind of addressing the risk before it even happens.
And I would, to support both of what these ladies are putting out here, I would say, I was sitting here listening and I just wrote down, do you have a checklist? Because what Marcia's asking is, what's the takeaway? What's the nugget for the brand owner? And one of the ways I started consulting was I had somebody come to me who was starting a new cosmetic business and she didn't know how to select a contract manufacturer. God's honest truth, I didn't know a lot about it either, but was raised by a contract attorney. So I kind of sat down and thought about it and we made a checklist, and I started that checklist in this case with how much insurance do they have? Are you additionally insured for the products and for how much? Things as basic as that. And then you get into validating any kind of claims you're making, and it evolves. It just keeps changing. After all these years, like I work directly with most of our producers. In many cases, I've been to their production facilities. I still have to ask them questions. How do you do this test? What exactly is the process for this particular thing? And so over time, you'll just keep adding to those checklists. But I really advise sort of cover checklist for every ingredient, for every contract manufacturer, for packaging as well. It's the same kind of thing once you've identified those criteria. And you just want to make sure that you have all that stuff, because usually once you have it, you're done. It's a lot of work up front. But once it's done, man, you feel so good. The other thing I would share, I had this happen a lot. I served on a state of California board, an advisory board to the Department of Health. And as Rachel has indicated, the states are doing a lot of this stuff. And on quite maybe half a dozen occasions, the guy who was the chief enforcement officer, who I knew rather well because he'd sat on many meetings with me, would call and say, do you know this person? Yes. Are they doing this because they just don't know, or is this deliberate? And he was really hitting on the fact that there are people who don't care. They're just going to go after the dollar as hard and as fast as they can. And they're not going to take the time to learn what they need to do to comply with the kinds of expectations that we've talked about today. And so be aware that even in law enforcement, there are people who literally judge you as to whether or not you are intending to comply with the law or not. And so I think that that's it's helpful. I mean, in all the cases that he called me, I could say, no, they really, in one case, it was an 87-year-old woman who had an ingredient business. And it was like, no, she just doesn't know. You know, she just doesn't know. So you have to, there's a humanity involved, is what I'm saying here.
Well, thank you. I can create a checklist just from all the information and insights I got from this conversation, and I hope other brands can too. Thank you all for being here. Let's keep pushing for clarity, trust, and smarter claims in this space. So have a good rest of the day and week, and we'll see you next time.